Whenever I'm reading a book, I do this thing where I write down any interesting words that I've found, any intriguing words in a notebook. Then later on I'll sit at my computer and I'll look up the words in order to find out the interesting etymology and the definitions behind them. Well, then I decided that the second part of that process, the looking up words part, should be a show. So, welcome to Define, the boringest show on YouTube, right here at the Launchpad Writers Club. Cheers. Welcome back to the Launchpad Writers Club. I'm Andrew Lewis. This is another episode of Define, the boringest show on YouTube. We're going to look up some words, of course. I promise you guys that soon there'll be videos on this channel that aren't just me looking up words. You know, we're a writers club and the whole point of this channel is to share lessons about writing or being a creative person and interviews with creative people, but we're just not quite there yet. We're working on it. But for now, good old looking up words will have to do. Now, the first word today is a word that I discovered in my own short story. How does that make sense? How can you discover a word in your own story? I'll tell you how. I wasn't quite finished the story, and then I showed it to my friend Robbie Verhagen, who's a very good writer. And he just started to write. He just separated where I finished. He wrote chapter 2 and then just continued writing mid-sentence. And I quite like what he wrote. He's a better writer than I am, so I kept it in there and just called it a collaborative short story. So it goes chapter 1, me, a little bit by Robbie, chapter 2, and then chapter 3 is me again. I finish it off. And that's actually available, by the way, as a zine, that short story. Just put it up a few days ago, links below. But the word that he wrote, which I had to look up, was flotsam. Flotsam, flotsam, flotsam.
Flotsam.
Flotsam, which is the wreckage of a ship or its cargo found floating on or washed up by the sea. It's a nice word, it's kind of poetic, that ship wreckage on a wavy sea, you know, washed up on the shore. Now I'm just looking here that there's, in this Wikipedia, there's different words in maritime law for different specific kinds of shipwreck. Shall we? There's flotsam, which we just went into, jetsam, lagan, and derelict. Flotsam, a sunken vessel whose goods float to the surface of the sea or any floating cargo that is cast overboard. Jetsam is similar to flotsam, but it's stuff that was deliberately thrown off the vessel, like jettisoned overboard to lighten the load of the ship, okay? And there's different legal implications in maritime law about the ownership of those. Let's not get too far into that. Lagan, also called ligan, goods that are cast overboard or are heavy enough to sink to the ocean floor, but are tied or otherwise linked to floating marker so that they can be found again, okay? So something that would have sunk but is tied to something that'll float, okay? And derelict is goods that have sunk to the ocean floor, relinquished willingly or forcefully by its owner, and thus abandoned, with no hope of reclaiming. Okay, right. That's strangely specific. All of those things are things that were lost from a ship while that ship was being wrecked. I'm not going to define all 4 of those in the book. I think we'll just go with flotsam. Okay. Wreckage of a ship / cargo found floating / washed up. Cool word. Now if you're interested at all in reading the short story where that word cropped up, it's called Cut Strings. It is zine number 2. Andrew Lewis zine number 2. There's a link below. That zine, by the way, the project is I want to write a book of short stories. I'm working on a book of short stories. It'll be 20 stories or so, you know, in a novel-sized book. But what I want to do is, as I finished each individual short story in their rough draft, I want to release those stories as zines, one at a time. So if you follow the project along, you can have in your bookcase like 20 zines and then the actual book that eventuated from those zines. I don't know, I just think that's kind of cool and quaint, novel. I quite like the handmade bookmaking thing. It's quite fun. Next word, wherefore. It also is a good way to fund the creation of a book of short stories by selling the individual stories as rough zines. You know, it's like every time I finish one, it's a little, I might only sell a handful of them, but just a little bit of influx of cash makes the project keep ticking along, which is a good model, I think, for a writer, because it's hard when you write a book. It takes you 2 years and you don't know for 2 years that you're working on it if anyone's going to buy it. It's just too much of a financial risk. You know, if you write a song, it takes you an hour, and if no one likes it, you've wasted an hour. 2 years, yeah, you know. Next word. Wherefore. Wherefore.
Wherefore.
Wherefore. I put this in here because, I don't know, it's just one of those commonly misinterpreted words. Everyone thinks it means where, when it actually means why. You know, the wherefore art thou Romeo? She's not asking, where are you, Romeo? She's asking, why are you Romeo? Why must you be who you are? Because they're star-crossed, forbidden lovers, you know. She wishes he was someone else. Wherefore? For what reason? As a result of which? I'll keep this one quick, eh? That's just a little, I don't know, I found that interesting. Why? Another Shakespearean-ish one. Shakespearean-ish. Whence. Whence.
Whence.
That's what I said. From what place or source? Another quickie. I could do a whole series of these videos just on the Shakespearean words. There's some interesting stuff. The guy liked puns. He's pretty big on puns. Quickly run through those two. Let's move on. PYRRHIC victory. That's really 2 words, but let's not get into semantics. I like this one. A PYRRHIC victory is a victory that inflicts such a devastating toll on the victor that it is tantamount to defeat. Tantamount meaning equivalent to. So it's like a victory, technically you won the war, but you couldn't win another war like that because it was too devastating. I think there's some quote like that. If we were victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. Kind of cool. Should have seen the other guy, hey? Now, the PYRRHIC victory comes from King Pyrrhus of Epirus, whose army suffered irreplaceable casualties defeating the Romans at the Battle of Heraclea and the Battle of Asculum. I'm probably completely butchering the pronunciation of that, but that's okay. I want to see this battle. Battle of... I'm working one-handed because I've got a bad wrist. Asculum. I'm just letting it hold this pen so it feels like it's useful, but actually this hand is completely useless now. It's okay, guys, I'm getting an X-ray on it tomorrow. Don't worry. Now, the cool thing about this Battle of Asculum is it had war elephants in it, supposedly. In just about every picture that I can see, here, there. Yeah, there's some war elephants in the background there. It seems that this was at one of those times in history where war elephants were used, which I just think is so cool, because war elephants were so cool. There's this little narrow slice of history between when they started using elephants in war and when they invented cannons, which was the end of elephants in war, gruesomely enough. But in that little slice of history when they did, it's so cool, because elephants are just awesome. My whole first book, which I happen to have right here, is you'll notice a little detail at the bottom. The whole thing is centered around a city that uses war elephants. And the whole reason that book came about is I was learning about war elephants and how they were really used in actual history, and it was so cool already that I didn't need to embellish it at all. I just kind of took that bit of history, put it into a fictional setting, and that was it. So the elephants in my book, they're not like Lord of the Rings, mystical, magic, exaggerated elephants. They're just normal elephants, which I think is just, I don't know, I love that. So why is it so cool? Here's a few reasons. Elephants are smart, smarter than a horse, much smarter. And they're also more sort of dexterous and coordinated than a horse. So if you were riding an elephant, you'd have much more control over that elephant than you would, say, a horse. And not only do you have more control over its movement, you can also control its trunk. So they could use the elephant's trunk. The rider could instruct the elephant to, throw that person over there with your trunk, pull that guy's arm off, they would just go about messing the place up, rampaging through history. And what's even cooler is the way that they use the elephants in executions. So they would do public executions, like a gladiator show style thing. And the elephant would understand that it was trying to torture the person, not kill them. So it would avoid the person's vital organs while it would stomp on its hand or rip off his leg or whatever. So that's all true bits of history. That's not from a fiction fantasy book. So I just grabbed that and went, plonk, fantasy setting. That's cool enough already. The other good thing about writing about elephants is that elephants have a lot of rituals which are easy to humanize. Like they visit the graves of their ancestors, and they have the similar sort of family values. It's easy to humanize them, which is always good, because the elephants in the book become characters, more or less. And so we want to be able to sort of, in a weird way, relate to them on human terms. Anyway, that's probably enough me going on and on about elephants. PYRRHIC victory. PYRRHIC victory. A victory that takes a toll tantamount to defeat. Next, solipsistic. What a word. Why would I do that? Solipsistic. I'm going to go solipsism so we can get the pronunciation.
Solipsism.
Solipsism. Solipsistic. Alright, what is solipsism? Jeepers. A theory holding that the self can know nothing but its own modifications, and that the self is the only existent thing. Extreme egocentrism. Right. So, the solipsistic person believes that only they exist and everything else is just a figment of that imagination. I guess it comes from Descartes. Descartes was the original guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." So Descartes' whole theory is, briefly, you can only perceive the world through your senses, and your senses it's possible that your senses are wrong. Sometimes you hear things that aren't there. Sometimes you see things that aren't there. So they can't be trusted. And then so if the only way you can know something exists is via one of your senses, then you can't be 100% sure that that thing exists, because your senses can't be 100% trusted. That's the theory. So then what did he do? He took every single thing off the table and said, nothing exists until I can prove, without using any of my senses, that it exists. That's what he tried to do. And then after quite some thought, he was a thinky man, he decided that the only thing he could prove existed without using one of his 5 senses was that he existed, and the way that he proved that was that he figured that he was able to think, and therefore he must exist. Right, I think, therefore I am. So what does all that mean to the solipsistic? Well, so I guess the solipsistic folk kind of took that to heart and figured that I can't prove that you exist, because the only way I can do that is with touch and smell and taste and hearing and sight. I think those are the 5 senses. But I can't trust those 5 senses, so I can't be quite sure that you actually exist. I'm sure I exist because I'm thinking these things, but do you? Prove it. And then you say, I exist. And you say, oh, I heard you say that, but can I really trust my own ears? It's a silly theory. It's dumb. Anyway, let's write it down. It's rather juvenile and very egocentric. Well, it's completely egocentric. Right, what am I writing here? Theory that only one's self exists. and everything else is a figment of your imagination. Well, aren't you just a vividly imaginatory person? Yes, those words. We've had a few word recommendations too over the last week, but I'll have to do them in the next episode. If you have any cool, obscure, interesting words you want to recommend, pop it in the comments. Now, before we go, I'm going to read this comment from Redditor Captain Taulin because it flatters me and I have a very fragile ego. Wow, I like this show, says Captain Nul. I do love learning etymology of words, and the mellifluous breakdown was very pleasant to hear. One of my favourite things is finding names for things I never knew had names. The most recent one I learned was pergola, the arch thing that ivy grows on. Also, my favourite word of all time is sesquicentennial, or 150th anniversary of something. You know, I actually learned that word last year when Lilydale Primary School, one of the local primary schools, made a launchpad book at their school to celebrate their sesquicentennial anniversary, their 150th year of being a school. It was quite funny actually. The theme that they chose to fit with that whole anniversary was 150 years. That was their theme. And what that meant is there was about 95 stories written by primary school kids that were about time travel. I think the lesson we learned was that you need a looser theme than that, otherwise you're going to get very similar stories. Still a great book though, I'm glad we did it. Hey, anyway, okay, that'll do us. We're done here. That's enough word learning for today. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.